Eileen was 67 when she lost her husband, Thomas, with whom she had shared more than 4 decades of life in Alaska. Together, they built not only a solid wooden house, erected with their own efforts amidst the relentless cold, but also a routine marked by simplicity and complicity. In the days leading up to the funeral, she seemed numb, as if living in slow motion. Between organizing the wake and welcoming neighbors who came to pay their condolences, she barely realized the true weight of his absence. The pain of loss was already overwhelming, but she had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The wake took place in the living room of the house, as is common in some rural communities. Thomas's coffin was positioned near the window overlooking the snow-covered landscape. The flowers his friends had brought were already beginning to wilt, spreading a bittersweet scent throughout the room. It was a scene of farewell, but also of heavy silence. The family gathered around the body, exchanging restrained words, avoiding too long gazes. It was at this moment that Andrew, their only son, approached his mother with an expression she had never seen on him before. Cold, hard, almost hostile. The words came without warning, cutting like blades. "This is no longer your home. Get out!" The silence in the room shattered. The phrase echoed louder than any prayer she had ever uttered. Eileen gasped, as if punched in the chest. Before she could even react, she felt her son's palm slam against her face. The slap burned her skin, but it was her soul that shattered. It wasn't just physical violence. It was the denial of everything she represented. Mother, wife, the foundation of that family. There, before her husband's coffin, she was declared a stranger in her own home. Beside Andrew stood Tanya, his wife, with her arms crossed and a satisfied, almost triumphant look. The contempt on her face left no doubt that there was influence behind her son's words. Her daughter-in-law never hid her ambition to transform the house into a more modern space, free of the old memories that, in fact, were memories of a lifetime. The scene was cruel. While Eileen was still processing her husband's absence, she was cast out like an uncomfortable burden, treated as an obstacle to be removed. The coffin, the flowers, and the bewildered neighbors became mute witnesses to this rupture. The initial shock gave way to a feeling of absolute emptiness. Eileen walked to the room she had shared with Thomas and began to gather some belongings automatically. She didn't cry, didn't speak, just moved as if obeying an invisible force. Each open drawer was a cut. Each photograph seen was a memory transformed into pain. Her body, still heavy with grief, now also carried the shame of being rejected by the one she had raised, nurtured, and defended so many times. The question echoed unanswered. How could a son turn against his own mother with such coldness? The neighborhood whispered, but no one intervened. Some glances showed compassion, others silent disapproval. Eileen realized that, once again, she was alone to deal with a blow from life. In the old car parked in the driveway, she packed a makeshift suitcase and drove aimlessly, leaving behind not only her home but also her sense of belonging. The Alaskan winter seemed even colder that night, and the icy roads reflected her loneliness. Inside her, however, something was beginning to stir. Not anger, but a quiet determination that still had no name. That first night away from home, Eileen slept in a small roadside motel. The hard mattress and musty smell didn't matter. What really kept her awake was the incessant replay of what had happened just hours before. The slap, the words, her son's hardened face. Each memory throbbed like an open wound. But amid the pain, there was one detail she couldn't forget. Thomas, in life, had always insisted that she should know her rights and never be completely dependent on anyone, not even her own son. Those words now seemed to resurface like a clue. It was in this simple room that Eileen realized she couldn't surrender to the role of helpless victim. Grief would accompany her, but it wouldn't be her prison. What Andrew didn't know, and perhaps never suspected, was that his father had prepared documents precisely to protect his mother from being left destitute. She hadn't yet opened the folder tucked away in the back of the closet, but she remembered, well, the conversation in which Thomas reassured her, saying that nothing could take her from what was rightfully hers. The pain of betrayal still burned, but with it a spark of resistance was born. The next morning, her face still scarred from the slap and her body heavy from lack of sleep, Eileen quietly returned to the house, not to reconcile but to retrieve the folder Thomas had left hidden in the back of the bedroom closet. It was a sealed manila envelope dated months before his death. She remembered well when he had given it to her, asking only that she keep it safe and only open it when truly necessary. In that instant, she knew the time had come. Sitting in the car, her hands trembling, Eileen opened the envelope. Inside were copies of documents, mortgage agreements, and finally, a supplementary will she had never seen before. As she read each line, her heart raced. Thomas had carefully stated that any act of abuse, insult, or attempt to expel her by Andrew would result in the automatic loss of all inheritance rights. It wasn't just legal protection, it was proof that her husband had anticipated the worst and wanted to shield her. The tears came, but this time they weren't of pain, but of relief. It was as if Thomas was still there, protecting her even after he was gone. Eileen realized she wasn't as vulnerable as Andrew and Tanya had believed. Besides, the papers made it clear that she was co-owner of the house, with responsibility for the mortgage. This meant that, legally, she had as much or more power than her son. For the first time since the wake, she felt she wasn't helpless. With the documents in hand, she went to the bank to confirm the information. The manager greeted her with a respectful look, as if he'd already known the story from afar. He confirmed everything. Eileen's name was on all the records, and the will's clause was fully valid. More than that, the bank made it clear that without her signature, no agreement regarding the property could be made. Andrew and Tanya, despite their arrogance, were much more fragile than they realized. As she walked back from the bank, a mix of emotions washed over her. There was anger, yes, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in knowing her son didn't have the control he thought he did. Remembering the scene at the wake, the slap and the cruel words, she felt a flame ignite inside. She was no longer the same woman who left the house with a makeshift suitcase. Now she held the key too, turning the tables, and she was willing to wait for the right moment to use it. In the following days, Eileen remained silent. She didn't confront her son or daughter-in-law. She observed from afar, gathered information, and calmly organized everything. Andrew and Tanya began posting photos of small renovations they were making to the house on social media, calling it our new home. The captions were full of excitement, almost as if they wanted to prove to the world that they were on a winning streak. What they didn't know was that every hammer blow they took to the walls was a step closer to their own collapse. Eileen then made a strategic decision. She canceled the mortgage payments she had always kept current. She knew this would have swift consequences. Andrew, who had never dealt with heavy financial responsibilities, didn't even realize what was happening at first. But the bank did, and the default notices began to arrive. With each letter Andrew opened, his confidence diminished, and Eileen silently watched his arrogant edifice begin to crumble. It was an invisible turning point. While Andrew and Tanya were still posing for smiling photos, showing off their new furniture and renovation plans, the house's fate was already sealed. The power they believed they held was nothing more than an illusion. Eileen knew its downfall was inevitable, and that this time she wouldn't need to raise her voice to be heard. She just had to let time take its course, because the truth was already on her side. The first weeks after the wake were a silent game of resistance. Andrew believed he had taken possession of the house definitively, as if his mother had disappeared from history. He posted photos of the backyard, smiled beside Tanya, and spoke proudly about our new life. But behind the scenes, he began to feel the weight of the collection letters, the bank notices, and the responsibility he'd never known how to carry. His confidence was fueled by ignorance, and Eileen knew this better than anyone. She didn't respond to provocations or try to argue. She carefully guarded the documents, discreetly consulted lawyers, and wrote down every detail. With each meeting with the bank manager, she felt more confident that she was on the right path. Her silence was strategic. It wasn't weakness, but intelligence. While Andrew deluded himself with the idea of victory, she set up an invisible board where his every move brought him closer to checkmate. Social media became a showcase for Tanya, who showed off new furniture, modern paintings, and captions extolling her dream of renovation. In the comments, friends congratulated her, unaware that it was all built on shaky ground. On the other side of the screen, Eileen watched silently. There was no envy or sadness, only the certainty that this brilliant scenario would soon crumble. She knew there was no need to rush. Time was working on her side. One day, Andrew received the first notice of possible foreclosure. The official document bearing the bank's seal shocked him. For the first time, his protective mask began to crack. He tried calling his mother, but Eileen didn't answer. He tried sending messages, which went unanswered. It was as if he'd lost contact with the only person who knew how to handle the household's affairs. And it was precisely this absence that made him realize, albeit belatedly, how much he'd always depended on her. However, Andrew's pride wouldn't allow him to admit it. Instead of talking to his mother, he blamed the bank, the bureaucracy, and anyone but himself. Tanya, in turn, reacted angrily, saying that the house needed to be in their name once and for all. But when they tried to resolve the matter themselves, they discovered that Eileen's signature was indispensable. Without her, there was no deal, no renegotiation, no way out. As the couple grew weary, Eileen grew stronger. With each passing day, she felt less like a victim and more like someone in control. She still carried the pain of the slap and expulsion, but now that memory fueled her determination. It was as if her son's cruel gesture had opened her eyes to a new version of herself, a woman who knew her worth and was no longer afraid to act. It was during this period that Eileen decided the time had come to reveal the truth. She didn't just want to prevail through silence. She wanted everyone to know what really happened. She gathered documents, records, proof of ownership, and even a copy of the recording of the day she was evicted, made by a neighbor who witnessed the scene and gave it to her out of solidarity. With all the evidence in hand, she planned to call a meeting with the entire family. What was about to happen wouldn't just be a conversation, but a moral judgment. For the first time, Andrew would be exposed before everyone, without masks, without excuses. Eileen wasn't seeking revenge, but justice. She wanted the truth to come out, for her pain to be acknowledged, and for her son to face the consequences of his own choices. And above all, she wanted to regain her dignity in the face of those who still believed she was just a fragile and silent mother. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon at the home of an aunt everyone respected. Eileen had invited her, but no one knew exactly why. There was only the promise that it would be an important meeting to resolve family matters. Andrew and Tanya attended with a certain arrogance, as if about to reinforce their new position as masters of the house. The other family members were driven by curiosity, unaware of what would be revealed. Once everyone was present, Eileen entered with a folder in hand. There was no fear in her posture, only firmness. She began recounting what had happened on the day of the wake, with details that made the atmosphere tense. Many were incredulous upon hearing that Andrew had thrown her out and assaulted her. It was then that she pulled out the first document, the supplementary will left by Thomas. Silence fell over the room as she read aloud the clause that disinherited her son in the event of abuse. Andrew tried to interrupt, claiming it was a fabrication, but was immediately confronted by the lawyer present, who confirmed the document's validity. With each explanation, it became clearer that what the couple believed they controlled was never truly in their hands. Tanya shifted uncomfortably in her chair, while Andrew, increasingly nervous, avoided looking at his mother. But Eileen wasn't finished yet. She then showed the property deed, proving she was co-owner of the house. "Without my signature, nothing can be done," she said, looking directly at her son. Next, she displayed the default notices that had been piling up. The weight of the evidence was unquestionable. Finally came the final blow. The recording of Andrew throwing her out, his cruel words and the slap echoing through the room. The entire family could hear it. There was no longer any room for doubt. The atmosphere turned into a moral tribunal. Cousins, uncles, and even nephews, shocked, stared at Andrew, speechless. Some muttered undertones. Others simply shook their heads in disapproval. What had previously been seen as a contest of narratives became an indisputable truth. Andrew had humiliated his own mother, and now the consequence was losing everything he believed was rightfully his. Eileen's lawyer made a point of explaining to everyone that Andrew was legally excluded from the inheritance, with no possibility of contestation. Tanya tried to argue, saying it was unfair, but her voice sounded weak against the avalanche of evidence. The silence in the room was heavy, but at the same time, liberating for Eileen. For the first time since the day of the wake, she felt in a position of strength, recognized and respected. Andrew, visibly shaken, tried to justify himself. He said he was in shock over his father's death, that he didn't know what he was doing. But the images and documents left no room for excuses. The truth was clear, and the entire family now knew it. The looks of disappointment on his relatives' faces weighed more heavily than any court ruling. This was the public trial Eileen knew needed to happen. In closing, Eileen took a deep breath and simply said, "I didn't lose my home. You lost everyone's respect." The words were firm, but not filled with rancor. It was the acknowledgement of a moral victory, a definitive turning point. In that moment, Andrew ceased to be the admired son and was remembered as the man who tried to destroy his own mother and failed. 2 days after the meeting, Andrew appeared at the door of the small rented room where Eileen was temporarily staying. He didn't arrive alone. Tanya came with him, holding a simple bouquet and a tense expression. Andrew spoke quickly, his voice choked, saying it had been a mistake, that the shock of the wake had taken him out of his mind, that he never meant to hurt her like that. Eileen didn't interrupt. She asked them to come in, offered them water, and waited for the stream of excuses to dry up. The silence that followed weighed more heavily than any scolding. It was time for them to face what they had done. Andrew then cried. The tears weren't pretty or restrained. They were the collapse of someone who lost control and saw the ground disappearing. He begged for forgiveness and then asked for help. He said the bank was pressuring him, that the letters kept arriving, that they didn't know what to do. Tanya, more restrained, tried to organize her arguments. If Eileen signed a renegotiation, they could get everything in order. She promised respect, promised a healthy distance, promised to do it right this time. It was a package of promises wrapped in urgency. Eileen listened without looking away. There was no unnecessary harshness in her face. There was clarity. She said that forgiveness, as a feeling, was not a bargaining chip. She could forgive what happened, but that didn't erase the facts or the risks of repeating the pattern. She recalled being kicked out during the wake, that there had been assault, public humiliation, and an attempt to take the house over her rights. She spoke calmly, without raising her voice, not to punish, but to make it clear that boundaries exist for a reason. Then came the revelation. Eileen revealed that she had already initiated the sale of the house to a foundation that transforms properties into shelters for abandoned elderly women. She explained that the proposal was in progress, with a deposit paid, and the contract in the final stages of registration. She said it wasn't about revenge, but a fair conclusion. This house, built with the labor of 2 people, would now protect others who, like her, were pushed out their own doors. The information hit Andrew like a second sentence, this time definitive. Tanya, surprised, asked if there was still time to go back. Eileen replied that it wasn't a simple financial matter. It was a life decision. She said she'd spoken with the foundation's coordinator and heard stories of women who slept on acquaintances' couches, who lived in fear of returning to hostile environments, who had been silenced for years. She said that, given these stories, tying the house to a family dispute would be a waste of purpose. It wasn't about who wins the house, but rather where it now points. Andrew tried one last tactic, promising to sell the car, take out a loan, work twice as hard, anything to avoid losing the property. He asked her to think about her grandchildren, their birthdays, and the holiday season. Eileen reminded her that presence and affection can't be bought with bricks. The relationship with her grandchildren would depend on respect and care, not a dress. She repeated that she forgave her son as a mother, but that she wouldn't give in materially. Forgiveness isn't permission to start over the same way, she said, with a serenity that left no room for error. To conclude, Eileen opened the folder and showed the schedule. Signing dates, property transfer, bank deadlines. She explained that she would use her share to start a new life elsewhere, away from the tension that gripped her home. She offered something concrete and limited, a list of legal and financial contacts to guide them on how to deal with the defaults they were already responsible for. That was the most she could give. Technical assistance, no more emotional rescue. Andrew and Tanya left dejected. There was no slammed door, no shouting, just a whispered, "Thank you for listening," a look of someone who understood too late. Eileen was left alone in the room, took a deep breath, and realized the weight on her chest had shifted. It still hurt, but it wasn't a paralyzing pain. She picked up her phone and sent a short message to her son. "I forgive you. I can't support you. When you want to talk about the grandchildren, call me." She put the phone away and looked at the folder with the papers for the new phase. The next morning, she signed the final round of documents at the notary's office, and that afternoon, she visited the foundation to meet the shelter's future team. She listened to the renovation plans, pointed out practical aspects of the house, explained where the light shines best in winter, and how to insulate some windows. She left helpful instructions, like someone passing the baton responsibly. Upon leaving, she walked to the bus stop with a simple sense of relief. She had done what she needed to do. She hadn't saved her son from his own actions. She had saved herself from a repeat. The sale of the house was completed without a hitch, and Eileen soon received her share of the proceeds. With this money, she decided to invest in something she had always wanted but never had the courage to do. Live in a secluded place, surrounded only by nature. She visited several properties and, after days of searching, found a simple cabin on the edge of a frozen lake, a few hours' drive from her old town. The building wasn't luxurious, but solid and welcoming. Upon entering, she felt this could be the place where her life would truly begin again. The first night in the cabin was silent. The wind blew against the windows, and the lake reflected the full moon like a mirror. For the first time since Thomas's death, Eileen slept soundly. There were no hostile footsteps in the hallway, no scornful glances around, just her quiet breathing, and the comfort of being in a space that now represented freedom. The void left by her husband remained, but it was no longer suffocating. It was a void that could be filled with new meanings. In the following days, she occupied herself with practical tasks, arranging furniture, making small renovations, and learning to use the fireplace as her primary source of heating. She discovered that, even at her advanced age, she still had the strength and autonomy to sustain her own routine. Each log carried, each dish prepared alone, was proof that she didn't depend on anyone to live with dignity. It was exhausting, but rewarding. Eileen rediscovered herself in small daily victories. Loneliness, which had once felt like punishment, now felt like a companion. Eileen began walking around the lake every morning, observing animal tracks in the snow and listening to the silence that only Alaska could offer. On these walks, she reflected on everything that had happened and how she had managed to survive what seemed unbearable. She realized that her son's betrayal had hurt deeply, but it had also opened the space for her to finally prioritize herself. One day, on one of these walks, she met a distant neighbor, a woman named Margaret, who lived in another cabin nearby. They talked at length, and Eileen shared a bit of her story. To her surprise, Margaret had also faced family abandonment. This exchange sparked something in Eileen, the realization that she was not alone. She discovered that there were many women with similar stories, scattered everywhere, living in silence. Encouraged by this discovery, Eileen purchased a simple recorder and began recording her own version of events. She spoke of how she was expelled, how she felt invisible, and how she transformed pain into action. She recorded alone in the cabin, with no initial intention of sharing it, simply as a way to organize her mind. But over time, she realized that these recordings could be useful to other women. She decided to create short posts in online community groups, sharing parts of her journey. The response was immediate. Messages began pouring in from younger women, grandmothers, and mothers who had experienced similar rejections. Many said they had never had the courage to speak out and felt encouraged by hearing Eileen's story. What began as a rant became a movement of identification. She began to be sought out for advice and to share strategies for dealing with situations of emotional and financial abuse within families. Over time, Eileen realized she had transformed her greatest trauma into a legacy. The lakeside cabin wasn't just a refuge. It was also the starting point for a new mission, giving voice to forgotten women. When she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw just a widow scarred by expulsion and loss. She saw someone who, despite everything, chose to carry on. And that choice became, day after day, an inspiration for many others. Eileen's home recordings, made without much pretense, began circulating in community groups and local websites across Alaska. Someone shared a snippet of her recounting the day she was kicked out of her home, and soon the story spread. It wasn't long before other women, many of them elderly, commented, saying they had lived through similar experiences, some kicked out by their children, others cast aside by their husbands, or mocked by silence for the first time. Eileen felt her pain had become a channel of connection. Soon they began inviting her to community meetings. At first, Eileen resisted. She felt she wasn't prepared for public speaking. But Margaret, her neighbor who had become a friend, encouraged her to try. "Your story is already helping without you even realizing it. Imagine if you spoke while looking them in the eye," she said. Eileen agreed. And at the first meeting, held in a small local library, she found 10 women gathered on makeshift chairs. The room was simple, but the attention everyone gave her made her realize the importance of what she carried. That day, Eileen told everything unvarnished. Her husband's death, her son's slap, her expulsion from the coffin, the discovery of legal protection, the sale of the house, and the purchase of the cabin. She spoke calmly but firmly. Some women cried, others applauded. One stood up and said, "You're telling my story, but with your voice." This moment was decisive for Eileen. She understood that she was speaking not only for herself, but for an invisible multitude of forgotten women. The impact was so strong that they began to call her a role model. They asked her to return for other meetings, to participate in interviews on local radio stations, to offer practical advice to those still experiencing silent abuse within their families. With each new invitation, Eileen felt more empowered. She was no longer just a widow cast out by her own son. She was a woman who had transformed humiliation into dignity and found purpose in the midst of pain. However, she never sought fame or recognition. She continued to live her simple routine at the cabin, tending the fireplace, walking around the lake, and preparing her own meals. The difference was that now she had a support network that had previously been lacking. She received letters of thanks, messages of encouragement, and even simple gifts from other women, such as hand-woven scarves and used books, accompanied by notes of affection. All of this reinforced the feeling that she had created a collective bond. Over time, even younger people began to follow her. Some university students, interested in gender and aging studies, asked to interview her. They wanted to understand how someone her age managed to transform such a devastating episode of rejection into fuel for autonomy. Eileen welcomed the conversations, always reiterating that she didn't have ready-made answers, but that speaking the truth was, in itself, an act of resistance. Some even tried to criticize, saying that exposing her own family was a form of revenge. But Eileen knew how to separate things. She reaffirmed that she wasn't seeking to defame anyone, just to share her experience. She said that hiding the facts to protect those who hurt her would only perpetuate the cycle. Her calm and firmness dispelled any accusations. It was clear that her voice wasn't filled with resentment, but with courage. One day, as she was leaving a community meeting, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. She said her mother had been through something similar, but had never had the courage to speak out. She said that listening to Eileen inspired her to face the situation and support her mother in seeking help. At that moment, Eileen realized the impact of her words. She was not only helping older women, but also influencing new generations to break the cycle of silence and neglect. Local recognition turned into larger invitations. A regional radio station invited her to participate in a special program on aging and family. In the studio, in front of microphones and with her headphones on, Eileen felt her heart race. But when she began to speak, she realized her voice was firm. She told her story without embellishments, stating the facts simply. The host was silent for a few seconds after listening to her, and then said, "You just gave a voice to hundreds of women who have never been able to speak." That marked a turning point. After the interview, messages began arriving from even further afield. Women from other Alaskan cities and even neighboring states wrote with similar stories. Some said they lived in fear of financial dependence on their children. Others described situations of abandonment after decades of dedication to their families. Each message confirmed what Eileen already sensed. Her case was not an exception, but part of an invisible pattern. The collective silence was beginning to be broken. With this momentum, local senior support organizations invited Eileen to share her journey at small but meaningful events. She always carried her document folder, no longer as a weapon against Andrew, but as a symbol that information is power. She explained the importance of knowing one's rights, having clear contracts, and not giving up one's autonomy. She didn't just inspire emotionally, she offered practical tools so others wouldn't be caught off guard. Meanwhile, Andrew became a name avoided at family gatherings. The truth revealed at the previous meeting had left deep scars. Few sought him out, and he himself began to avoid appearing. For Eileen, there was no satisfaction in seeing him isolated, only the realization that choices have consequences. She never stopped loving her son, but she understood that love doesn't mean allowing abuse. This painful learning was part of the message she conveyed to the other women. Once, at the end of a lecture, a woman hugged her and said, "I too was kicked out of my home by my own son. I thought I was the only one. Now I know I'm not alone." These words echoed in Eileen's mind for days. She realized her role had grown beyond what she imagined. It wasn't just about telling her story, but about creating a space of belonging for those experiencing similar situations. A space where shame gave way to courage. In the cabin, activity was visible. The phone rang more. Letters arrived in greater numbers. Some women asked for practical advice. Others simply expressed gratitude for people like her. Margaret, her neighbor, helped organize responses, and together they began cataloging the stories they received. It was an unplanned task, but it became almost a daily mission. Eileen, even tired at times, felt fulfilled by this new purpose. Despite the growing attention, she never changed her lifestyle. She continued her morning walks around the lake, enjoyed baking fresh bread on freezing days, and still spent afternoons reading by the fireplace. What had changed was the feeling of being reconnected to the world, but now on her own terms. Her life no longer revolved around the approval of Andrew or any family member. It revolved around her own autonomy and the impact she could make with her voice. It was in this context that the idea of transforming her recordings into a short book of stories emerged. University students who interviewed her offered to help with the transcription, and a community publisher was interested in publishing. The book would not be for profit, but for distribution in community centers and libraries. Leafing through the first drafts, Eileen was moved. It was like seeing her journey printed not only as a personal memory, but also as a tool for collective struggle. The book launch took place in a simple community hall, but filled with occupied chairs. There were elderly women with canes, curious young women, academics, and even local journalists. Eileen, accustomed to speaking to small groups, was surprised by the number of people who came just to hear her voice. When she held the first copy in her hands, she felt the symbolic weight of that moment. It was not just her story that was printed there, but also the reflection of the hundreds of stories that had reached her. During the event, she read a passage describing the night she left home with a makeshift suitcase, still in shock from the loss of her husband and the assault on her son. Her voice broke at points, but she didn't stop. When she finished reading, the audience rose to their feet in prolonged applause. Many women approached her afterward to say they saw themselves in that scene, that they had felt the same emptiness of being discarded within their own families. The book wasn't just a testimony, it was a mirror for many. Local newspapers reported on the launch, highlighting the courage of an elderly woman who transformed pain into a collective struggle. Soon, copies began circulating in other regions, sent free of charge by partner organizations. Eileen received messages from women who said they read the book aloud to support groups, using its words as a starting point for difficult conversations. This confirmed that the work's impact went beyond what she could have imagined. Even with the repercussions, Eileen maintained a low profile. She declined invitations to appear on major TV shows, preferring to remain close to her local communities. She said she wasn't seeking a spotlight, but rather real transformation. This decision further increased the respect people had for her. They saw authenticity in her, not ambition. Each gesture reinforced that her fight wasn't about fame, but about giving visibility to those who had always been ignored. Over time, support groups began to form, inspired by her journey. In small towns, women gathered to share experiences, guided by Eileen's story. Her name circulated as a symbol of silent but steadfast resistance. What began as an individual story transformed into a decentralized movement, empowering those who had never felt heard. A major milestone occurred when the foundation that had purchased her former home sent photos of the completed renovations. The space had been renovated, welcoming elderly women who had nowhere else to go. Seeing those images, Eileen wept silently. It was as if a cycle had closed. The place that had been the scene of her greatest pain now served as a shelter for those who also knew the weight of abandonment. It was proof that her decision not to cling to the house had borne concrete fruit. She printed one of these photos and placed it on the cabin wall above the fireplace. Every time she looked at it, she was reminded that her suffering had not been in vain. It had become something greater, for the benefit of many. This memory sustained her on days when she missed Thomas so much, or when Andrew's absence still weighed heavily. The pain remained, but it was accompanied by purpose. In her inner circle, Eileen maintained contact with the few family members who remained by her side throughout the process. They viewed her with renewed pride, recognizing her strength and courage. She was no longer the silent aunt or sister who lived in her husband's shadow. She was the woman who faced her own family and managed to turn humiliation into an example. At each family gathering, she realized that her presence now symbolized respect, not fragility. As the months passed, Eileen established a balanced routine between the silence of her cabin and community gatherings. The frozen lake, which had previously seemed merely a solitary setting, now became her companion on her journey. Each morning as she walked around it, she reflected on the distance she had traveled since the day of the wake. The woman who left home with a makeshift suitcase and unshed tears no longer existed. In her place was someone who had found strength in the midst of loss. Contact with women of different ages only reinforced her conviction. In each encounter, in each letter, she realized that her pain had multiplied into hope for others. Many reported concrete changes. Elderly women who began to demand their rights, daughters who decided to protect their mothers, families who began to talk about respect and boundaries. Eileen understood that her experience had become a tool for social transformation. What had previously been mere survival was now a collective contribution. One day she received an unexpected visitor. One of the coordinators of the foundation that had purchased her old home came to the cabin to deliver a tribute. A small wooden plaque with the inscription, "This home was reborn because you had the courage to say no." Eileen held the plaque with trembling hands, overcome with emotion. She placed it in a special corner of the living room as a reminder that even the most painful chapters can bear fruit in new life. Andrew didn't contact her often again, but on one occasion he sent a short letter apologizing again. Eileen read it in silence, kept the letter, and decided not to respond. Not out of resentment, but because she knew that certain wounds need time, not repeated requests. Her forgiveness had already been granted in her heart, but their relationship didn't need to be resumed. It was a difficult decision, but necessary to maintain the peace they had achieved. The seasons passed, and the cabin became her permanent home. Eileen learned to reap small daily victories, baking fresh bread, lighting the fireplace herself, walking even on the heaviest snow. She discovered joy in photographing the landscape and sending the images to the women who followed her journey as a way to show that there was beauty after pain. Her photos, accompanied by simple phrases, circulated online as reminders of resilience. On her 70th birthday, a group of women inspired by her organized a surprise. They gathered in front of the cabin, bringing flowers, cards, and cake. They sang together and told stories of how their lives had changed after hearing her story. Eileen cried, but this time with joy. She realized that she had not only rebuilt her own dignity, but that she had become part of the dignity of so many others. It was as if her life had gained a new family, not of blood, but of affection. Looking back, Eileen understood that nothing could erase the pain of the slap or the expulsion, but she also realized that it was the starting point for her liberation. Had she not experienced the rupture, she might never have discovered the strength she carried. The legacy Thomas left in the documents was the foundation, but true rebirth came from the choice to act, to transform pain into a voice. And now, over time, that voice echoed far beyond what she could have imagined. On the last night recorded in this account, Eileen sat on the cabin porch, a cup of hot tea in her hands. The lake reflected, the soft glow of the stars, and the cool wind blew gently. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling at peace. For the first time in a long time, there was no fear, no urgency, no sense of loss. There was only the certainty that, even though she had been driven from her own home, she had achieved something much greater: the freedom to live in peace and the odd honor of leaving a legacy for so many other women.